We are going to start. If you want, you can move with your plates and come in and sit down. Good evening. It's really nice to see so many people coming for this launch of Openly, and it's just wonderful. The reason we decided to come and start to cover LGBT news is that every time we publish a story on this, and you know that everything that we write at the Thomson Reuters Foundation is distributed by Reuters. Every time we write a story about it, one of our journalists around the world, it's used by all newspapers and media outlets around the world because nobody covers seriously LGBT. So it's 2 years that Antonio and I are looking for funding to start doing it. So finally we can do it with a bit of funding. We hope to have more. And with a lot of pro bono also. So we really appreciate. I'm Monique Villin. I'm the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And yesterday we were in this room and we had a big event to give awards to the lawyers who participate pro bono into Trust Law. And Trust Law is a brief program, I'm sure some of you here are benefiting, to help the best NGOs and the best social enterprise around the world to do a better job thanks to the brain of lawyers who help them deal with what they need to do. Many of them are also about diversity. Many of the NGOs and social enterprise we help are working in that environment. And last year, one of the winners of the awards was Equality Illinois. And it's an NGO that wanted to suppress, wanted the abolition of the law which in the US authorized gay conversion therapy for minors. And so a law firm did the work. They did the advocacy after that, and in Illinois, they have suppressed that law, which is a great thing. And it's not finished. They now do all over the states, and we hope to get there. For those of you who have never been at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, good evening, and it's a pleasure to meet you. We also welcome the representatives of the United Nations LGBTI core group, and in particular Stavros Lambrinidis, the European Union's Special Representative for Human Rights. I would also like to welcome our friends at the Free and Equal campaign of the United Nations Human Rights Office, who are co-hosting the event with us this evening. We are all looking forward to a very powerful conversation featuring LGBT activists from around the world who have experienced firsthand the pressure resulting from adverse and biased media coverage. Many of you know that journalism is one of the pillars of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and just as we push the rule of law in 175 countries now where we operate with Trust Law, we believe in the power of news to shed light on fundamental issues, make government more responsible, or at least they have to hold their responsibilities. So we not only have a big team of journalists now, we start, I mean, 10 years ago we had 1 journalist. Today we have 60, so it's not bad. 60 staff journalists and 250 freelancers around the world. So it's a big network, and it's good. So what we cover is what we call the underreported issues. And we think that LGBT is also an underreported issue. Every day we write about modern slavery, and we are becoming very big on that because we received the funding from the CNA Foundation that allows us to have 9 journalists in 9 countries like India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Cambodia, Mexico, Brazil, and of course London and New York. So we are going to really be massive on slavery. We are already the biggest producer on news on this issue, which is a big issue of human rights also, the worst of all, probably. So we write about slavery, we write about women's rights. We started with women's rights. We report also about property rights. Property rights, especially for women, is a very big issue all around the world. And we are distributed by Reuters, so it gives a big audience, potentially an audience of 1 billion people a day. So our journalism abides to what is known as the Reuters Trust Principles. And the Reuters Trust Principles are fairness, impartiality, independence. And because we report impartially on issues which are underreported, people take notice. Because if you are biased, or if you are, I mean, you can be, and in the US, I think it's fantastic to see the media, how they have stood up to what happens in this country. It's fantastic, but it's a bit biased, we can say also. But it's good they do. But we don't do that. So we remain impartial in our coverage of the United States the same way. Our stories have led to government investigations, and I'm thinking particularly here of an investigation we had done on the mica mice in India, where children not only work, but sometimes die. And the government of India had to, after we published it, and it was used by all newspapers in India, had to act on it, and you know that. I think of a number of organizations in the front lines who have received funding after we told their stories. So sometimes also news can have a positive impact. We need better informed societies, especially in these times. And I'll give you just one example. An independent report has recently shown that our coverage of land and property rights has contributed to 10% of the overall global news conversation on the issue. We didn't do this report. It was an independent source. But this is exactly what we call impact, and I must thank here the Omidyar Network for giving us the funding to cover this big issue. So tonight we are very exciting because we launch openly. So it's another arms into our battery of journalists. And it's a global news and information platform dedicated to LGBT plus news. I always forget the plus, sorry. And this is typically an underreported topic. It looks big because we have this big launch, but we are still small. We have 2 journalists dedicated to LGBT news at this today, but the 60 journalists of the foundation plus all the freelancers, of course, contribute their news. The editor is here in the room, and you have already met him. Hugo is there. He comes from the AFT, and we are very lucky to have him and his passion. We across the world, we obviously see a big crackdown and dangerous crackdown on civil society. The attacks that we have seen and continue to see in some countries against LGBT people are a stark reminder that we have not won the battle for inclusion. I think of Chechnya, where we continue to witness a horrifying state-sponsored campaign and persecution of LGBT people who are illegally detained, starved, humiliated, and tortured for simply being who they are. I think of Malaysia, where just 20 days ago, 2 women were publicly canned for being in a relationship. I think of Egypt, where exactly a year ago, a rainbow flag waved at a music concert provoked a violent crackdown against LGBT people. And this crackdown led to more than 65 arrests. And the people who were arrested had to suffer anal medical examination, a practice which lacks totally scientific validity, violates medical ethics, and in the words of the United Nations, is a form of torture. And Egypt is a country where also homosexuality is not illegal. But of course, we have seen also in the last years a few progress. Top of the list, of course, is India. And we have here someone who works at the Supreme Court of India, so bravo. India, who was 3 weeks ago, the Supreme Court has decided to decriminalize, I cannot say it. Anyway, you have all understood. Decriminalize consensual same-sex relations, scrapping a law which went back to colonial times and the times of the British Empire. This is huge. It's a country of 1.3 billion people, and the court stated that to criminalize same-sex relation was irrational and indefensible. Very simple. India's decision follows the recent moves in favor of LGBT rights in Costa Rica, in Bulgaria, in Belize, and Trinidad and Tobago. So, there are still 71 countries where homosexuality remains illegal. In 8 countries, you risk the death penalty. And 40 of these 71 countries inherited the discriminatory legislation from the time of colonization. So we have a big responsibility on that. Most LGBT rights are human rights. We have to defend that human rights exactly as we stand for women's rights, for freedom of the press, or modern slavery. Most of you know Antonio Zappula, who is my number 2 and the chief operating officer of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and is the driving force behind Openly. I mean, it's 2 years. He has knocked at all doors to find the funding and to help build that. So fantastic. He's going to tell you a lot more because he knows a lot more than me. But I just wanted to say that I work with Antonio since 5 years at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I am always amazed by his passion, not only for LGBT rights, for everything. I mean, he is passionate in his job. De Gaulle once said, speaking of someone, he was like De Gaulle, the great French statesman. He was lacking the quality that without which you don't take good action, and this is passion. So passion is the quality you need to have in your work if you want to do great things. And Antonio has that by the millions. And by the way, you know that he was nominated on the FT list of LGBT most influent, I don't know exactly what, the Financial Times list of the most influent people in the charity, gay in the charity business, or something like that. Very important. Here he goes.
Suki, you will be able to mention the exact wording on the chart that Monique was referring to. Suki's in the room. Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And as Monique said, it's a very special evening. I've been involved in this project really from the beginning for the past 2 years. So to see this happening, to see this campaign on Times Square tonight, it feels a bit surreal, to be honest with you. It feels like planning and going to your own wedding, and you know, it's an amazing feeling. Very happy that this is happening. Jokes apart, I know so many of you in the room here tonight, so I know it's been a busy week, and it's phenomenal to have you here. It's a very strong vote of confidence. And as you walk into the building, you must have seen our advertising campaign that's running across Times Square. It's running, in fact, across 300 screens here in New York and another 400 in London. And what you would have seen, and are real words used by the media in the past 2 years in describing and reporting on LGBT plus people. And I think some of those words will come on screen right now. They are filthy, disease, devil worshipper, disgusting, abnormal, pedophile. These are just some of the words that we selected. And I'm sure that for some people walking down on Times Square or in London, this might be a shocking surprise, perhaps, because at the end of the day, we've been more accustomed to see the media reporting, at least here, the progress for marriage equality, the increased support from corporates for LGBT plus inclusion, the increased visibility, for example, of the trans community. But let's not forget that this is really much a Western progressive narrative that we're referring to. And in fact, it's one very recent narrative, one that's really come together in the past 20 years. In fact, last week, a good friend of mine showed me a headline from 1981 from a UK paper that was referring to the opening of a gay club in London, which is still very successful. And the words that we're using in the article not only would raise a few eyebrows today, but actually I think would trigger an independent press commission. So much has changed since then, and really people's minds and hearts have opened towards greater inclusion of LGBT plus people, but this hasn't really happened by chance. The media has played a key role in shifting this narrative by dropping a witch hunting narrative and really adopting more factual and fair reporting. But sadly, many countries around the world, it's not the case yet. This shift hasn't happened yet. Take Uganda, for example, where a national newspaper published a front-page story with the headline, "Top Homos, Hang Them." Now, the article argued that gay men in the country had set a target to recruit 1 million children. And Kasia, who's here tonight, will tell you the real consequences that that article had on her life and the life of her friends. In Jamaica, a recent article claimed that gay people with guns were terrorizing local communities. And the story argued that many local gangsters were directly linked to the gay community through a network of male escorts. In Russia, where the 2013 anti-gay propaganda law forbids the promotion of behaviors that contradict traditional family values, the media has shifted towards a narrative which portrays LGBT people as pedophiles. And Lyosha tonight will give you a couple of examples of that. Now imagine for a second if you are at the receiving end of this vicious and public abuse. How would this impact your safety, your personal life, and your career? The reality is that while we stand here in this room, for millions of people around the world, the media actually constitutes a threat to life. It's a dangerous amplifier of stereotypes, of prejudice, and of hatred. And when this happens, let's be clear, nobody wins. And we all know that. When this happens, the result across society is very well documented. It translates into loss of productivity, into loss of competitiveness, into loss of talent. Even today, in the post-truth era, the media still has and retains the ultimate power to influence the public's beliefs, to shape attitudes towards social and political issues. And to be clear, I'm not arguing that the media should have an LGBT agenda or a pro-LGBT agenda. I'm simply calling for good journalism. Journalism which, by definition, is impartial, is fair, and is accurate. Journalism that sticks to the facts and leaves prejudice and agendas behind. Journalism that is bound to truth-telling alone. And that journalism still exists. And that is why tonight we're launching Openly, as Monique said, a global LGBT plus news and information platform powered by the journalism of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And we want to be ambitious. Openly wants to fill a critical gap in the market, bridging high-quality LGBT plus news to the widest possible audience, one which, by the way, includes also non-LGBT plus people. And thanks to our distribution model, all our stories will be published not only on Openly, but also on the Reuters Newswire, reaching a daily audience of 1 billion people every day. In practical terms, what that means is that today's story, for example, that runs on Openly's top page on Colombia's indigenous communities, LGBT indigenous communities, has landed on news desks both in Norway and in Saudi Arabia. So our distribution strategy alone is already challenging the system, is already playing an important role in normalizing the conversation around LGBT plus people. Our goal is ambition. Openly wants to become the ultimate source for LGBT plus news in an environment where the topic remains largely underreported and confined to niche outlets. Outlets which, by the way, are regional, have a regional focus and predominantly cater for LGBT, often actually gay male audience. We really want to change that. We believe, because we can prove it, that authoritative, impartial, non-advocacy journalism plays a significant role in advancing human rights. By shedding light on the many and important issues affecting LGBT+ people around the world, we can affect powerful change. When we reported about a discriminatory sex education campaign run by the government of Malaysia a few months ago, the media pressure resulting from our story prompted the Malaysian Health Ministry to drop the gender identity disorder category that they had initially included. LGBT+ rights are human rights, and at the time when the Sustainable Development Goals commit us to leave no one behind, it's through the power of the media that we can ensure that these goals are indeed met. Because when trusted, factual journalism thrives, society is always in better shape. Thank you. Thank you. And now, before we move on to the conversation, I would like to thank our friends at Barilla, who are supporting openly, and in particular, Luca Di Leo and Kristen Anderson, who have really strongly believed in this project from the start. I would also like to thank Serge Dumont, who is the vice chairman of Omnicom, together with Paul Hogan and Christina Peach, or Peach, as we all call her, Fleischman Hillard, and the team at TBWA in London, who have been fantastic. So Fleischman Hillard and TBWA are two agencies of the Omnicom family, and they are the people behind our brilliant campaign that you're seeing on Times Square today. They have worked entirely pro bono for us for over 6 months, so a huge thank you to you guys. And thank you again to Fabrice Odart and Ricky Hennem at the Free and Equal campaign, who are one of the reasons why we're here tonight with the UN. Thank you. I remember our coffee a couple of months ago, and now this is happening. Thank you, Fabrice. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Stavros Lambrinidis, the EU's Special Representative for Human Rights and one of the representatives of the UN LGBTI Core Group. The Core Group was established in 2008 and is a cross-regional group of 23 UN member states, plus the European Union, the UN Human Rights Office, and 2 NGOs, Human Rights Watch and Outright Action International. Ambassador, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Monique, Antonio, to everyone here. We live in dangerous and disturbing times. Human rights were always anathema to authoritarians around the world, but increasingly the values of tolerance, of inclusion, of rule of law, the values upon which human rights are in fact based, are not at all popular with populists who see them as impediments to their ability to bend their people's, their institutions, their regions' will to their own. And scapegoating and prejudice, of course, is in that climate extremely popular. Now, we, the European Union and the LGBTI core group of the United Nations, in whose name I speak here today, strongly reject the current overwhelming negative and caricatured representation of LGBTI people in the media, which only leads to misinformation, violence and prejudice. We stand for the fair presence and representation of LGBTI people and matters which concern them in the media. I mentioned violence. I was in Honduras on an official visit a few years ago, and it was on the day that Rene Martinez, a remarkable man, a remarkable LGBTI activist, was murdered. He was one of a series of LGBTI activists murdered in Honduras. I interrupted all my official program, and I went to the center of LGBTI activists in the Honduras, and I met with all of them. And I issued a press release, and I called the media to come in, because I wanted them to understand that for the European Union, this is no joke, it is no footnote. It is not okay. No official visit is as important as standing up for everyone's rights. And it was covered, thankfully. Now, the issue has not disappeared. The issue has not disappeared. But violence and incitement to violence that many media around the world engage in against LGBTI people is a scourge. And it has to stop. But it's not just violence. If you look at the way that LGBT persons are underrepresented and often portrayed in an entirely fictionalized manner in media, including Western media. You should be concerned, as are we. Most often, these characters, as they appear in different shows, have entirely unrealistic personality traits. They die in surreal ways or serve hypersexualized purposes. In addition to stereotyping and stigmatizing in the worst possible way LGBTI people, these portrayals leave an entire generation of LGBTI youth without role models. And that is also shameful. Now, in the mainstream news, to go to the news, LGBTI content is often absent or unreliable. News with LGBTI content have, until today, only been accessible online, on blogs and other platforms, reaching a much more limited audience than other news. And these online platforms, furthermore, tend to be accessed only by members of the LGBTI community itself. I have to say that your amazing initiative, as you described it, Antonio, makes that huge dent in that bad situation. It reaches everyone. Now, I hope that those receiving your reports in Saudi Arabia will decide to print them or to report on them. But it may take some time. The fact is, you are legitimizing, as you said, objective, important news on every news desk anywhere in the world. That is amazing. Congratulations. Now, dear friends, the European Union has been active in dispelling negative media narratives by revising its own Audiovisual Media Services Directive. This policy aims to fight discrimination and hate speech by banning incitement to hatred and incitement to violence. The directive now explicitly includes sexual orientation as a basis for hate speech, and it thus makes it easier to fight it. It also demands the EU member states to protect citizens from incitements to hatred on large online platforms through, for example, flagging and reporting overall promoting a safer media space. Now, in my visits around the world, I very often raise LGBTI issues and discrimination issues. And I'm very, very often faced with a complaint by foreign ministers, justice ministers, police chiefs, and others. Why is the European Union poisoning the water of our wonderful relations by raising issues that are so unpopular in our country? Mr. Lambrinidis, look, the latest poll, 80% of our people don't like gays and lesbians. Why are you raising those issues? Why are you advocating for the unpopular? Interesting, isn't it? It's a deeply felt belief by those who express it. It sounds to their ears like reasonable. There are many things I say depending on the situation, but I'll tell you two. The first thing I say is, no one in the LGBTI community, no one advocating for equal rights for LGBTI people is asking for special human rights. LGBTI people do not deserve special human rights and are not asking for them. But they deserve the exact human rights that any other person has. If you cannot kick me, if you cannot criminalize me, if you cannot throw me in jail, if you cannot silence me or fire me because I am black or white or straight or Greek or French, you cannot do it because I'm gay. You cannot do it because I'm gay. There are no special rights. They're the exact same rights. We're all human beings. We're not animals. We all have human dignity. All of us, the exact same one. And the second thing that I often tell them is, you know what? You ask me this question, and you point in your country to a minority that is not popular. Guess what? We are all minorities. We are all minorities at some point in our lives or another, including you and you and you who are making the argument. Even in this room, you can be a majority because of, I don't know, your gender. And you may feel that because of that, you have the power and even the right to impose different rules on the minority gender in the room. But in that majority in which you belong at this particular moment, you are at the same time a minority on something. You may be a minority because of the color of your skin, or because of your religion, or because of your political beliefs, or because of your disability. The moment that you assume that it is okay to violate the rights of the least popular because you're the strong person on the other majority side is the moment you're opening the door to hell. It's the moment you're opening the door to violent discrimination against you as well, even if you don't feel it at this particular moment. Dear friends, let me close with this. As I said, we live in dangerous and bad times. Nelson Mandela said once, and it's one of the most brilliant things, in fact, I've heard it, certainly in my job. He said, if we can be taught how to hate, we most certainly can be taught how to love. In fact, loving comes easier to a human being than hatred does. A baby that is born looks someone who is a different skin color, is interested, touches, looks, doesn't hate. Someone has to teach you and tell you at some point in your life, this is the wrong color. Our instinct is not to hate. If you can be taught how to hate, you can be taught how to love. I hope that the Thomson Reuters Foundation can help the world a little bit to learn how to love, including LGBTI people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Great inspiration. And as many of you know, there's a huge, definitely not great, political story developing tonight as we speak in Washington, D.C., which means that Don Lemon unfortunately had to rush to D.C. to cover the story. He has sent us a message before we move into the panel that we can all listen to.
Hello, everyone. This is Don Lemon. There is a big news story coming out of Washington, D.C. this week. Big news stories, as a matter of fact, and I need to be in the city to cover it. And as a result, I will not be able to moderate the very important conversation that you are all here to listen to. So I want to say thank you to Openly for thinking of me to be a part of your launch event as an organization, and I truly appreciate it. I really do. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I won't hold up the conversation any longer. So thank you all for attending, and to the panelists for the inspiring and informative conversation I know you will have.
So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the night, Nicole Young. Nicole is one of the most awarded female producers in broadcast journalism in America today. She's a producer for 60 Minutes, the most watched news program here in the United States. She's been honored with 11 news documentaries Emmy Awards, 3 Alfred DuPont Columbia Awards, 1 George Forster Peabody Awards, and many others that, Nicole, I won't mention. And during her time at 60 Minutes, Nicole has done terrific reporting, from following the trail of toxic electronic waste illegally sent to China to reporting on the business of gold mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is fueling, as you know, one of Africa's deadliest wars. In 2014, Nicole became also senior producer for CBS Evening News, and during her time at the Evening News, she produced interviews with President Barack Obama, as well as interviews with First Lady Michelle Obama and President Bill Clinton. Nicole tonight is in very good company. On the panel with her are Kasha Nabagezera, founder and executive director of Freedom and Rome Uganda, one of the most respected and courageous LGBT voices from the continent of Africa. Amir Ashur, the founder and executive director of Iraqueer and a formidable One Young World ambassador. Maria Fontanelle, program officer at the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, a former journalist and now an activist for one of the strongest LGBT NGOs in the region. Landon Wilson, a U.S. Navy veteran who was kicked out of the U.S. military for being transgender. Lyosha Gorshkov, a co-president of RUSA LGBT. Lyosha taught LGBTQ and gender studies in Russia. He was an openly gay professor and activist in Russia until 2014, when he was forced to leave the country after he was threatened by the government and law enforcement. So I'll leave you to the panel. Just a reminder that the hashtag for tonight is #OpenlyNews, and our handle on Twitter is @openly. Thank you.
Well, Antonio, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I'm so honored to be here. I'm so proud of what this means for journalism and for journalists like myself. I work for 60 Minutes, as Antonio said, and being able to have this as a way to find stories is just going to be such a rich resource for people in my field and everywhere. And it's so important, and it's, quite frankly, every human's right to have reporting done on them fairly, honestly, and truthfully without any kind of bias. We're all humans, and no one should be reported any less than anyone else because everybody's story matters. And hopefully this will allow people to see that every single person's story is equally important and should be given the same amount of integrity and honesty as anybody that is being reported on. I certainly will be using it. However, I'm more excited to hear about what our panelists have to talk about. So, and I have the luxury of being able to speak with them and having them speak to you. So we're going to start with Losha. Losha, you are a pioneer in your field, and I am humbled by your story and your life. You were one of the first academics in Russia to develop a queer studies curriculum in 2012. And that development basically put your life at risk. And you are now here in New York as an asylum seeker, and because of who you are and because of who you love, you were forced to leave your country. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that journey and how it brought you here in front of us today.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very difficult, I should say, especially in the context of political turmoil here, and you're coming from the country which persecutes people like myself and facing the same mistreatment sometimes, being an immigrant and queer here. So the journey took me so long because I've been studying since 2005, and I was the first in political science department. It's not Moscow, it's not St. Petersburg, it's rural. Not rural, but industrial area in the wild part of Russia. And you know, in 2009 I got my PhD. I was naive and I was thinking that everything was gonna be okay. But eventually when crackdown came from the church, from the government, they started portraying us as the pedophiles, especially public educators. And I got threatened by the right-wing activists, Orthodox groups, and some people on the streets. I got beaten up severely a couple of times, and nobody will protect. I never go to the police even here, because sometimes I should as a president of RUSA, but I don't trust government, I don't trust institutions like the police because of mistreatment of myself. And eventually in 2013, when the law was passed calling propaganda of non-traditional values, I was approached by Federal Security Services, a successor of KGB, who started recruiting me. I became deputy of dean at that time. And you have to report on students and colleagues who are LGBT, or he said homosexualists, nationalists, and communists. And all of a sudden my apartment was under watch. I was followed by a lot of groups, and it came out to my understanding that I had to do something. And the article in 2014, March, came out and put on the table of my rector, head of the university, saying that propaganda of sodomy at Penn State University, and they were demanding to fire me, actually. And I didn't have any choice. It was already obvious, because I've been followed since 2009. I got PhD by Secret Services, but now they had a legitimate course to persecute us. And eventually I was driven by my friend, and for 6 months I've been staying in this sanctuary of my friend's apartment. I couldn't go publicly, but I was doing my job and activism as well. So it's very difficult. Was in 2012 even launched first queer studies, because I had to fight not with the external world, with the internal world, with my co-professors and colleagues who called me, behind my professor intelligentsia, called me faggot. So that's very sad, and it led, I'm just briefly talking about that, but I had much more experiences with being persecuted and apparently in the media. And that's why it led me to flee country, to escape, because it was obvious they will be firing me or put me in some jail, and Secret Services already portraying me as a national betrayal and foreign agent. And that time it was very popular to say that I was the agent of Hillary Clinton and State Department of the United States because of my identity as a LGBTQ person. And that's, I got here in March 2017, I got my asylum status.
You around quite a bit, unfairly so. Could you tell me a little bit about the vigilante movement called Occupy Pedophilia? You had mentioned the word before, and I want to hear a little bit about that.
In 2011, the government passed the law, the Duma parliament passed the law called pedophilia law, which basically was applied on LGBT gay male people and has nothing to do with pedophiles. And it was a huge campaign in the media portraying gay people as child molesters, and us, who are public educators, were forced to go to the police every single year to get we call it spravka, a record that you've never been charged with pedophilia, even you are working with students over 20. So it's ridiculous. And all of a sudden, on this basis, you should see all of this garbage. You have to understand Russian TV and media all controlled by the government, except a couple of them. And it was a huge dissonance and a reference to the Western scene and Western degeneracy. And on that side, a lot of people, like parents, they organized parents clubs, started raiding the streets, looking for gay males who potentially would harass or molest their children and beat them up with the police agreement. And in 2012, the neo-Nazis leader called Max Tisak launched that platform in social media called Occupy Pedophilia, which they call Safari on LGBTIQ people. What they do, they go online, they invite people to pay fees, like 200 rubles, like $20, I don't know, $10, and they invite the person under 16 who goes online on dating apps with gay people, having encounters, arranging the meeting, and when meeting is arranged, a person doesn't know anything, arrives there, and he's surrounded by multiple people with cameras, and they started humiliated on camera. And sometimes it's very violent because he was neo-Nazi. They force people to drink their pee. It's a lot of like that, and a couple of my friends got trapped by that. So, and after that, they blackmail them. They send the tape to the employers, they demand, and all of those actions they are doing with the agreement of the police. Police forces them to do that. And it's, you can watch it online, it's around the world, and now it's like spreading around, go to Ukraine, Belarus, and all of these post-Soviet countries. And it's very sad because when you see a lot of parents who go online, those people, those perverts have to be humiliated, have to be mutilated, and we have to cut the penises and put them in throat. It's mother of 5 children in my home region. And it's very, very, nobody reports from the media side about the negative effect of that. They're saying that it's our duty because Russia has traditional values. What's traditional values? I have no idea. I cannot comprehend after 70 years of atheism. But actually, it was very, very sad. And my home country, my home region, it occurred to be public educators and my colleagues who got trapped by those people who just like, I don't know, I cannot name them. It's beyond my understanding. And that's why this environment poisons a lot of people and pushes them to go back to the closets and keep their identities and sometimes to collaborate with perpetrators in order to survive. That's how I lost some of my friends who are LGBTIQ.
Like they need openly more than anybody, don't they?
Yeah.
Dear goodness. You know, you're one of the founders of the Brighton Beach Pride.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So when I got here in 2014, what I found, it was very fascinating. Then some Russian-speaking resettlement area in New York, Soviet-oriented. It's even worse than in my home region. And those population, do not get me wrong, over 60% voted for Trump, Mazel Tov. But at the same time, and it was very difficult because since 2013, the influx of Russian-speaking LGBTIQ immigrants, particularly from Russia, increased drastically. And then where people resettle themselves in Russian-speaking areas because of lack of language, lack of resources, they cannot work legally, and they have to do something of the book. And it was my understanding when I started getting humiliated by some people calling me some worse prison, argot, or jail jargon they used since 70s in the in Soviet Union. And we face a lot of humiliation them in medical facilities when medical professionals call our people perverts and degenerate here in New York and NYU in Brighton Beach. And that's why it was my understanding that why we should come here and replicate the same fears we have to do something. And in 2007, it took me 3 years to launch the event because I had a lot of pushback from my own community who got scared and feared those compatriots because they're not only using LGBTIQ identity against them, they're using their immigration status against them. They're trying to say, oh, you immigrant, you have no rights here, I'm going to report on you. And they don't understand employer going to be in trouble because he hires you illegally. So that's what led me to the understanding that we have to break through the because a lot of coverage and media coverage, don't get me wrong, when I came in 2014, nobody was talking about Russia. It's like Sochi Olympics, but not about Russian speaking asylum seekers here being mistreated because it's a constituency, political games, money talks in Brighton Beach area, and that's why we launched the first Brighton Beach in 2017, and the second occurred in last May, and now we're having backlash from the one person from who was running for assembly in 2016, and the 2018 gonna be or 19 gonna be something very, you cannot comprehend what it's gonna be. But we still have a lot of, and my understanding, what I've been doing, I've been very outspoken because I don't give a damn about who you are. If you running from the Soviet, being victimized, how can you be a perpetrator yourself? I cannot comprehend. That's why I'm not loved by a lot of community leaders and by a lot of LGBT organizations, but we have to protect our people. That's my major goal here.
So I'm going to bounce over to this side. Kasia.
Yep.
You are one of the most respected voices in the African LGBT community.
What?
You are a journalist, and you are just such an example of a pioneer that I'm really humbled to sit next to you and ask you some questions. You know, Antonio referred to an article in his speech before about homosexuals being hanged during speech, and you and some of your activist friends were exposed in the article. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about it, of what exactly happened.
Yeah, just to get it on record, I'm not a journalist. I actually hate the media.
Nice. Nice.
That's why I was so excited to be invited.
We are happy to have you.
Yeah, because media has been really, really troublesome in my life, in my work, in my community. And I'm running a media house.
You're running a media house.
Yeah.
Well, you need to teach people how to do it right.
That's what I'm saying, that so people don't understand how all this connects. But because I need the media at the same time for my work.
Yes.
And I have to deal with it because for me to take the message out, for me to change the narrative, I need the media. So I have to devise means of how to deal with it. Yes, Antonio talked about my late friend, David, colleague, whom one of the people I used to fight a lot with. A lot. And even then, like 12 hours before he died, we had a fight at my bar over a beer, because I told him, you have to be there tomorrow at 1, because we have to have a security meeting, because we had just won a court case on the same issue Antonio was talking about, hang them. So we had planned to have a security meeting, because all of us, the three of us who are challenging this court issue, were getting anonymous, strange things. You go to your home, you find everything is down, nothing is stolen, but documents are taken. The car is out. And in my culture or in my tradition where we come from, even people steal food that is cooking from the pot. But here they are finding cars, they are finding TVs, and they're not stealing them. So we're like, they're looking for a particular something. So the three of us who decided to go to court over the hang them newspaper were like all of us were getting, funny things happening. And even when you say that the day David died, my Facebook, which is quoted all over, I said, this cannot be a coincidence. So this is the day before, like 12 hours before David died. I said, this is not a coincidence. All of us are getting threats after winning the court case. Something needs to be done. And I didn't know what was going to happen. So I met my 2 applicants at my bar, because I had the first openly gay bar in Uganda. And I said, guys, tomorrow is a public holiday. Let's meet tomorrow at lunch, because right now we are all excited, we are drinking, we cannot really reason properly. But of course, the gay movement was born in a gay bar or in a bar. And we know that most of our colleagues, not all of them are activists or advocates, but what they share with us over a beer is what us front activists are actually saying on these podiums. So we all have a role to play. Some people play it in bars, some people play it in the beds, under the legs, and, it depends. But I said, let's meet. Then at 1, no phone call. 5, the phone call I got was from South Africa. Like, Kasha, have you heard from David? To them, like, I've just woken up. We all had a drink yesterday, and we're supposed to meet for lunch, but none of us has called each other. It's like, Kasha, call David, he's in trouble. This is from South Africa. I'm like, okay, what's wrong with David? And then I get a call from Frontline Human Rights Defenders in Dublin. I think all of you have heard of Frontline Human Rights Defenders. And they're like, Kasha, have you heard from David? Because in David's house, because he was staying so far from town and so far in the forest, and I'd just seen him 3 weeks, and I said, David, you stay so far. How can we even help you if you're in an emergency situation? So in his living room, I put my number on the room, sitting room, like with a marker, and it's like, Kasha, I'm having guests in a week's time, a birthday party for my nephews and nieces. They're going to laugh at me to have. I'm like, no, I just want to put this. At least did I know that this is what could save him. But he didn't anyway. But at least they called. But because he was far, I lost him. But with David, I was not even in Uganda when that newspaper came out, hung them. I was not. I was on my way to Geneva, UN. And New York, a New Yorker called me, Josh, a reporter, and said, Kasha, did you really say this? I'm like, say what? Like, where are you? I'm like, I'm in Sweden on my way to Geneva to address the UN on CEDAW. Like, you haven't seen what is happening. I hadn't seen, because it's a new newspaper by students who were looking for cheap, quick money. And the only way you can get that in my country is to use vulnerable communities. Let me tell you, if you want to sell your chicken in Uganda and no one is buying them, write your advert, but put the title, Gay Man Eats a Crocodile. Everyone will read, looking for when is the gay man eating the crocodile. And they will read your advert. And then one day they will remember that, oh, there's this one selling these chickens. Because, honestly, sensationalization Now I'm French, like Monique.
Well, you know, you say, and it's rightfully understood now after
No, but
you've
the
told
thing
the
is
story.
this. Yeah, but the thing is this. The media is censored. Even to go back to that horrible experience, even for us to go and put adverts into the media to tell people that the barrier is going to be here, we had to pay newspapers. They said we cannot give you receipts because if we write the receipts in sexual minorities, Uganda, which is our network, the Media Council will close our store. We've been like here, 5 minutes to the show, and the Media Council is like, if you go ahead, we are going to close you down. We've had several of hosts who have hosted us been suspended, been cut off from their jobs, and we've had radio stations fined for simply hosting us. So it's an issue where it's money. You want to make money, quick money, just do anything about LGBT. It doesn't have to be right.
Just negative coverage of LGBT money. Thank you. You say.
It doesn't have to be right, but there is also a paper by the Media Council.
Tell me how the media and the way they, particularly in Uganda, broad stroke the narrative on the LGBT community relates to how the public see the community in Uganda.
The thing is this, the public follows the media. What the media says, this, as I said on Tuesday, those who watched or who followed, let me tell you, if the media says that so and so, these homosexuals are recruiting your children and they're infecting them with HIV, even those who knew you as Kasha, as friends, are going to say, but you do this, and then you're like, how can you ask me this? But now they've already changed their mindsets because they've been told. So the media has really changed the narrative, and that's why I don't like the media in Uganda. And we are always fighting, but I need them because I need to send my message. But they've reached a point where I said, let me make my own media, because they've reached a point where they go and cook up stories, which stories have hurt my community. They go because they don't have money right now, so they need to sell. So they go and say, there was a gay wedding last weekend, and this is what happened. And then they get all sorts of funny photoshopped photos, and they're exposing people, and these people are losing jobs. These people are losing their families because some of them are married. People are losing their families, doctors are losing. Let me tell you, it's a mess. It's a mess.
What are this, I mean, in every country so particular.
But also,
Hey, talk to me.
but also,
Tell me.
but also, the media has come running to me ever since I decided to open my own media outlet.
What are they running to you for?
Because I said, okay, you want to tell them about us in the name of shaming us, but you give them false information. Let me give you what to give them, which is true. So I opened up my own media outlet, running my magazine, named after me, Bombastic. I think all of you know Mr. Lava Lava, Mr. Shaggy, because Shaggy is loved in Uganda so much, and because it has been my nickname for over 20 years, so I took advantage of that. I'm like, people will run for this magazine because they love Shaggy. They will think it's Shaggy's magazine. And it's free because, of course, no one is going to buy a homosexual magazine. So I said, how do I play them? I'm like, they love Shaggy, and this is my nickname. So I named it after me, and I made it glossy, so that they don't use it to burn the charcoal stoves, you know, when we are cooking food. So they have to keep it because it's glossy, it's beautiful, and it's free. So, and they are fighting for them. I want to tell you, people are calling. Parents are calling, and they're like, I didn't even know the word transgender existed. I think my son is actually that. I think my daughter. And then I get priests, bishops calling and like, how did your magazine end up in my diocese? I'm going to sue you. The minister.
I'm going to sue you.
No, the minister, and this I'm going to say, the minister of ethics and integrity, and it's the only country in the whole world that has this ministry of ethics and integrity. He's on my case. He calls me, and there's an audio which I can share with you if you want. It's like a love and hate affair between me and him, because I'm suing him, I win, he loses, I win. So we are like that, and he closes. Unfortunately, is the one also who is causing so much, you know, hatred and fear. But the thing is this, he knows everything in all my magazines, because this is the 4th year, but he knows what is on page 54. And me, the editor, I don't even know what is on page 54, meaning the message is going. He went to the parliament and collected 74, according to the newspapers and TV, because he called a press conference. He called 74 magazines. And I told him, I actually sent 250. So where are the rest? They have them, they're hiding them, and they're reading them under their beds. So we just have to devise means of how to really check. Because if the media is being censored by our governments, what can we do? And now we are in an era where we have social media. So let's use that. And let me tell you, social media is like my work. Because people who cannot get what we do, like in their bags, because at home, and then we have like weekend movie watching, which they cannot watch in their houses. So we have centers. We are like, okay. So I'm out there, not because I'm not afraid. Trust me, I'm human. I'm afraid. But I'm out there because I know there's someone who cannot even have a quarter of where I am. So I'm out there to tell them, you're not alone. I'm here. And people ask me, why do you still go home? Yesterday I was protesting at the UN, and the Ugandans here I was protesting with were like, and you're going back home? I'm like, of course. They're like, you know that Al Jazeera and CNN are here and BBC? I'm like, that is why I'm actually here. The thing is this, it's not that I'm brave. It's because when I started this work, I was very young, 19 years. 19 years. That is 19 years ago. Yeah. So I said, my family welcomed me. Because I didn't have to come out because I didn't even know that there was something coming out. This is an American word or what? We don't have these words in our country.
Well, you know, you are clearly, you know, changing the voice for people in Uganda, and they're lucky to have you. And it's something that I think, you know, that I hope that openly allows your work to progress and be more far-reaching to people, because you are bombastic. But you're also brave, even if you don't want to say you are.
Yes,
and
but
we appreciate you. We really appreciate
you.
you. I'm going to speak with Landon now. Landon, you are a U.S. Navy veteran.
I am.
And you are a transgender male.
I am.
You're extremely accomplished, and one of the things that I really find interesting that I seem to have flubbed myself is the acronym LGBT plus LGBTQ, and one of the letters in the acronyms in this acronym, the T, seems to kind of get lost a lot in the narrative of what needs to be told. And I want you to tell me a little bit about your trans experience, and when the power of language and the trans experience, when did this issue first start to become an important one for you personally?
That's a loaded question there.
It is a long question. It is a loaded question. Not loaded, but long.
You know, I think particularly thinking about how language is constantly changing, right? And the language that we use now certainly isn't the language that we would have used even 5 years ago. So I think when we think about language and the inclusion of language, that we have to be mindful of the fact that language is constantly progressing. And I think that a lot of times when we think about LGBTQ plus issues, we're only really thinking about gay issues, and you know, a lot of times the bisexual movement is left behind. So a lot of the times that the gay movement really has just become the gay movement. So when we think about issues of marriage equality, or we think about issues of don't ask, don't tell in the US military, none of those things did anything for trans people, right? Because marriage equality is great, but what does that mean if I'm trans and I can't buy my wedding cake because I'm getting discriminated against in my job, or I'm getting fired from my job because I got married on Saturday, but my state doesn't have any sort of inclusion or employment protections for me, right? Oh, I'm married, yeah, for sure. No, I've been married for a while. But hypothetically, what does that mean if I have these marriage equality, but I'm scared to go to work, or I'm scared to use the proper gender pronouns, or I can't pursue any sort of actual opportunities because I have these barriers in my way? So when we think about inclusion, we have to really start to thinking about like what that means for everybody. And when we think about inclusion in the media, we have to also be mindful of the fact that in the United States alone, in 2018, we've had over 20 murders of transgender women now, right? And these are just reported that we know of. And so when we think about the fact that mostly all of these people have been transgender women of color, we have to think about what that means in the media, right? So we know that over 20 have been reported on, but what does that mean about the others that haven't been? Because the media has said that they're male, or that because they haven't had the opportunity to come out, or because they haven't had the resources to pursue a transition, or because they've been too scared to actually say, this is who I am, right? And this is happening every day. And the fact that we can't acknowledge that, if this were any sort of demographic of people, this would be a national health crisis, right? And we have to also understand that the life expectancy of a transgender woman of color is 35 years old, right? And a lot of this comes back onto the kind of stories that the media tells about trans people, or queer people, or gay people. And we have, you know, we really have to persist in, it's great to mourn us when something happens to us, but what are you doing to celebrate us while we're here? What are you doing to ensure that our resources are available to us, that we have job opportunities, that we have education opportunities, that we have opportunities for our undocumented, for our Native population, for our people of color, for our disabled communities, right? And all of this is so intersectional in that we can't say that we have progress if we're leaving such a large community behind.
You know, what are some of the common misuses of the language that you've observed as a trans person?
You know, I think one of the most common things we get is pronouns, right? I think people are confused sometimes about how proper pronouns are used, and I think particularly when we think about gender neutral pronouns, right? I think sometimes a gender neutral they really confuses people, or frustrates people that think that we have to be grammar appropriate. I teach English. Grammar is a construct. It's all a lie. So I think that when we think about our non-binary populations among us, we have to think about what it means to choose your own pronoun. reclaiming that is, how empowering that is to be in a world that doesn't really see you, but to say, I am here, and this is how I see myself, and this is how you are going to see me too.
And what's your message to journalists when covering the T in LGBT moving forward, particularly knowing that they're going to have hopefully more news landing on their desks with Openly?
I think the message is to just remain educated. I think, like I said, language is constantly changing. And I think that if you are ever in a situation where you are uncertain, ask that person that you're reporting on, right? And I think that a lot of the conversations that we're having now could be solved if we had more trans reporters reporting on trans issues. And that means employing queer people in your initiatives. It means ensuring that these people are meeting other trans people. And it means ensuring that just because people are LGBTQ+, that they aren't only reporting on LGBTQ+ issues. And I think that's something that we see a lot in television or movies or social media. It's recognizing that we are all here to learn, and that because language is something that is so flexible and so individual, that there's no harm in saying, what do I call you? But there is harm in assuming that that person is there for your sole education.
Well, it's, I had mentioned before, transgender is in some ways become trendy in the conversation, but not necessarily correct in the narrative. And if there's, one thing that I could do as a journalist, what would you tell me to do?
I think I would say to listen to our young people. I think that because we are in such a unique time in the United States, I think that we have a lot of responsibility to listen to the people that are going to be leading in our future. And I think that we have such a progressive and such a unique and such a liberating group of young people that are leading the charge forward, that the better off that we want to be, we have to listen to the young people that are saying that this is how it is for me. And I think that the quicker that we are able to kind of let go of what we want to control and more easily listen to the young people that are saying, this is what I want, this is what I expect, this is how I want the world to be for me, this is how I want you to leave the world for me, the better off I think all of us will be.
I'm honored.
Am I allowed to?
You're always allowed to talk.
No, because for me, this is a great opportunity to be here. Some of my colleagues here I've met, but others I read online. So I want to use this opportunity to, I've been reading and admiring and following and all this. Now I'm here with him, and why not get first-hand information? I just have a simple question. Is, like me, I began a movement almost 20 years ago, 19, in 2 weeks' time. So, and when we started this movement, we didn't even know these words of transgender. Many of my colleagues I began the movement with came out as gay or lesbian.
I'm going to ask you to hurry this up because I have 2 more panelists and we're running out of time.
Okay, I just want to know, what can you advise me to do when people shut people out for saying, today I'm Jacqueline and tomorrow I'm Jack, and I cannot do that? Because it has become like a fuss. And
we're going to let him answer so we can get to the other 2 real quick. Go on.
I think gender is something that is fluid, and I think that because we can begin to think about gender as something that we've created as people, as a society, right? Because what is male and female, if it's something that we don't really understand or know, that we can begin to think about the fact that as identities change and evolve, so too does gender, and so too do our understandings of gender. So just because I was this last week doesn't mean that I'm that person today.
Thank you. Maria, my Caribbean sister, you are a former journalist. You have more than 20 years in the business. And the Caribbean has its own issues, as many people know, with the gay LGBT community. And I wanted to speak with you a little bit about how the media portrays the LGBT community in the Caribbean, particularly. And if you can give us a few examples of some of the headlines you see.
Thank you very much for having me, and of course, not just appreciating the opportunity for being here, but for having a platform like Openly. And part of the reason is, again, that sense of us not being completely treated with respect in the media in the Caribbean. There are a lot of negative examples of headlines, but more often than not, the problem in the region, if you look at the region as a whole, we often hear about Jamaica. We've heard a lot about Trinidad recently because of the decrimination case in Trinidad. We've heard a lot about Belize because of the decrimination case there. But what as a whole in the region, because I represent ECAID, which represents the Eastern Caribbean and all the small islands there, what happens more is an erasure. You don't hear about LGBT people. They're not in the media. They don't make the news. That is partially because people tend to keep their heads down. When you keep your heads down, then, you know, you're safer. Despite the fact that we've had many killings of gay people, even in the small island Caribbean, where it's not considered to be so aggressive against LGBT people. You've still had murders mainly of gay men. The most recent one in St. Lucia just about 2 years ago, of a 17-year-old boy who was stabbed about 50 times. So we have those instances that people tend to keep their heads down, and the media in turn also do not cover LGBT people so much because we try not to make the news. However, generally it's seen that whenever you cover a story with any headline at all with LGBT people, the views, whether you're on broadcast news, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on social media, on your website, a simple thing such as when our organization is launched, for example, automatically gets a lot more views because people view it as something so exotic or so strange or so out of the ordinary and out of the norm that they want to know about it. Thankfully, we have been able to kind of shift the narrative. But in countries like Jamaica, we find that there are some media outlets that are dedicated, it would seem. I'm not in the editor, I'm not in the editor's head, but they seem to be dedicated to portraying a negative image of LGBT people more often than not. And they try to get every link possible to blur those headlines. But more damaging than just the headlines of the journalists, because thankfully in the Caribbean there is some standard. We don't have as much of the yellow journalism in the Caribbean as you'd have in some of the other, you know, like the tabloid type journalism. We don't have too much of that in the region, thankfully. However, what most of the news outlets would do, they would use the opportunity to let the public speak, more or less. So I would not have a headline that is too discriminatory. But at the same time, I would interview and say, oh, that's what the public is saying. This man on the street is calling people, and they would let them use all the derogatory terms without editing it, because that's what is being said. However, we have tried to work with the media to ensure that they have the proper terms. We're just talking about language. And that is where the challenge is for us, because the excuse often is that we don't know the term. As people of African descent, because the Caribbean is mostly people of African descent, with a lot of people of Indian descent, a very small European descent population. But the excuse is that we don't have those terms. Those terms are, you know, European terms. They're from the West. They're white people terms. So when you say LGBT, what's that? That's not us. So if you use a derogatory term, that's us, that's local. It doesn't really mean anything per se. It's just, you know, you're taking it out of context. But thankfully for us, and I do appreciate that the media in the region, we have a little bit, there is a kind of a standard that they've maintained where you don't get too much of the negative headlines that you do. And more so we'd see the headlines that are, as time goes on, they actually are a bit more moderate and they are more factual as opposed to being derogatory. And I could point to, sadly, Jamaica is, I won't call any names, but Jamaica is the place. And Jamaica is one of the bigger islands in the Caribbean with the bigger population, and one of those with the more negative outlook towards LGBT people. But if you look at the Caribbean as a whole, the media itself is more focused on erasing LGBT people. And they don't have that agenda per se to say that we are trying to portray LGBT people negatively. It's more a case of, oh, we just don't know. There are no gay people in the region, like, you know. We have been able to use that to our advantage in that when we are able to send our stories to the media, it is more likely to be carried.
How do you change the perception of the man or the woman who's being quoted in those articles or in those broadcasts that are delivering the message to the people as opposed to the headlines themselves? How do you change that perception?
Well, that's a long haul, as you can imagine. So in terms of using the media, to stick to that point, we try where possible to inform the media. We try to give them the language that we know is more moderate and encourage them to use it because they're the gatekeepers. They're the ones who will convey the correct language to the rest of the population. We try to explain to them and have workshops with them to say, this is the way you use these terms and this is why you use it. And we've had some good connections with the media, thankfully, in the recent past. For example, a young trans woman was killed in Antigua just this month. She was buried this week. And initially the reports were a bit discriminatory in terms of not naming her properly, not using her proper pronoun, not using her birth name, etc. But by this week on reporting about her funeral, we find that it was clearer. There was that clear use of her chosen pronoun, there was that clear use of that pronoun and the use of her name and portraying her respectfully. As in the past, for example, a few years ago, about 2013, I think, there were some murders in Guyana of trans women, and they reported that gay men, there was a altercation between gay men, and the gay men were killed by their lovers, and they used their given names, their birth given names, and the male names to refer to these trans women instead of using the proper pronoun. So we are seeing that kind of progress in, not just progress in terms of how it's used, but there's a demarcation in terms of the bigger islands like Jamaica, like Guyana, like Trinidad. We'd find more of that deliberate misuse and misnaming and that deliberate derogatory attitude towards gay people, as opposed to the smaller islands, which tend to approach media more professionally, I would say, in terms of just as factually as possible stating the case. But oftentimes, one or two reporters would show their colors by allowing, again, the public to make statements that would be, yes, derogatory.
Well, it seems like that you're working towards helping correct that in the best you can.
We're definitely trying, yes.
But it's a very long and tall order.
It is. I mean, we did a really good project with Outright, Siri's not here anymore, but for Outright Action International, that sought to actually lay out the terms and distribute it to the media houses and try to engage them around the wording, around the use, around why is it that you would respectfully refer to somebody, whether they're dead or alive, with the pronoun, the proper pronoun, etc., and use the name that they would prefer to be known by. And that has been somewhat successful. But the problem, again, with media, which is why openly would be so important, is that media in the Caribbean is not a field that many people go into. And those who go into it don't stay. There is a lot of turnover. So you're constantly having to re-educate, re-inform people, and fight against the biases that they have naturally. And sometimes the lack of information is genuine in that they know what they've learned socially, and they reflect that. But again, just that constant re-education and constant engagement with them is what is very difficult for us, because as you can imagine, our advocacy is not exactly, people are not breaking down the doors to come and say, well, I want to be an LGBT activist.
No one really wants to be.
Nobody wants to.
Well,
right.
Well, so, all of everybody on the panel has a tall order, but we thank you for your perseverance.
Thank you.
We have to leave time. He's not the least, even though you are the last, Amir. You have had an extraordinary journey as well as everybody else here, and you are the executive director of Iraq Queer. And you came out publicly in a society where being gay is an enormous taboo. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
I didn't really come out in the conventional sense that I would just sit down with my family and say, I have something to tell you. Not that there is anything wrong with that. If that's what works for people, then they should definitely have the ability and the opportunity to do that. But I always thought my sexuality is not different than my brother's, who I assume is straight. Why would I? You never know. But why would I treat my sexuality differently? So every time my aunt would say, "Do you have a girlfriend?" I would say no, and then she asks why, and I say because I'm not into girls, and she would add, "Not into girls now." Not into girls in his school. I never corrected them, probably because a part of me was afraid, but also because that was their addition to the story. It's not my job to keep correcting everyone who is adding to my story. But then the first time that I publicly declared that I was gay was because of my work, and I felt the necessity to be visible because I was starting to receive a lot of threats and a lot of consequences legally with the government, with the police. So I wanted to make sure whatever happens, I want to make sure that my story is still there for someone else who can pick it up at some point. So the first time my aunt really knew that I was gay was in an article when I was talking about the work we're doing that was published internationally. And there was a lot of negative reaction from my extended family, but my immediate family has been very supportive. The first question my mom asked me was, "But didn't you say you want an outdoor wedding?" I said, "I still do." She said, "To a guy?" And I said, "Yeah." So it's been a growing relationship, even with my family, even with my mom. And that's the kind of relationships that I'm willing to nurture and to have an open discussion with them, because I fully realize, you've been to Iraq, I fully realize that my mom did not grow up having access to all kinds of information. And I want to respect that. And I respect the fact that she is willing to be informed and to learn about identities. And honestly, we've been closer than before, even though, and I feel like I have more people in my life, even though I've lost most of the people in my life.
So you're so humble to know where your mother's coming from, and understanding that she doesn't have the opportunity or the exposure. What are some of the things she has exposure to when she's hearing things in Iraq about the description of LGBTQ or LGBT? My apologies.
I have the unfortunate task of having to watch the media coverage, whether written or TV. And I say unfortunate because it makes me angry every time I watch it. There is one of the words, mentally ill or faggot or other offensive words, are used at least every 30 seconds on TV in those programs that are focused on queer people. The majority of the written articles are also using these words. In rare occasions, they don't use them when they're just simply translating from another outlet. But I think for us, the problem has been, that they are misinforming the public, misrepresenting science. There are therapists who quote the World Health Organization and say that even the WHO says it's a mental illness, even though that information has been inaccurate for a couple of decades now. So this is the things that people are exposed to, and I think I'm privileged that my mom both is willing to learn, and also that we have this open relationship and I can, correct some of these information. But what about the general public that has literally no other source of information? And I think what's unfortunate, even in international media, is that it's very selective when it covers LGBT plus people. For example, when Orlando happened a couple of years ago, all kinds of media covered it, and I think it should cover it. But and that was, tens of queer people being targeted. In Iraq in 2017 alone, more than 220 people have been killed. and these are the only the documented ones. How many media outlets can you name that even mention these numbers, especially those that we didn't pursue ourselves and telling them, hey, this is happening, cover it. So the alternative source of information for people doesn't exist, which in my opinion might be a bit more dangerous than the misinformation that the mainstream media in Iraq is presenting, because they have monopoly on information.
You know, it's an example of it's not what you know, it's what you don't know, and it's about. Are you hopeful that the narrative can possibly change?
I'm hopeful that by the time, you know, one generation before me and the next generations take power, we'll be able to change the narrative and present something more neutral. I think, like Antonia said in the beginning, we don't want people to just say, oh, everyone turned gay and everyone, you know, be supportive of and have pride in all these things. We want people to tell our story the way we're telling them, you know, which makes me really excited about Openly. I'm cautiously excited because I want to give it the benefit of the doubt and see it grow. And I think, you know, it's important to remind all media outlets, not only Openly, that they have a responsibility, and we're not going to celebrate things before we actually see the results. But I think our jobs as activists, we've been, in the rare occasions where Iraqi media asks us to appear or be interviewed, we've had the one condition that you use the proper terminology. You can't really just keep saying these faggots, because when we advocate for human rights, we can't say, let's get the rights of abnormal people. People will be eliminated immediately. So we have to make sure the media knows what words we're using and what words are neutral when they talk about issues related to our topics, because if they don't, that will really make our advocacy work much harder than it should be.
Well, I think as long as the five of you are at the front lines of this, I see change in the hopefully not so distant future. I don't think we have time for questions, but I want to applaud everybody for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Kasia, Amir, Maria, Landon, and Leosha. Your stories are really inspiring and really encourage those in the room who want to support grassroots activism to really connect with these people tonight. That's really all for us. Just before we leave you with another message, this time coming from London, from our good friend Dustin Lance Black. And thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Hello and welcome to the launch of Openly. It's a news source for LGBTQ news around the world. You know, for a very long time now, the media has helped shape perceptions of who LGBTQ people are, but not always for the better. If you look back to the New York Times in 1963, when they first mentioned the word homosexual, they said it like this: growth of overt homosexuality in city provokes wide concern. And they said this: the greatest homosexual population in the world and its increasing openness has become the subject of growing concern of psychiatrists, religious leaders, and the police. The New York Times sounded alarm bells, saying that the most powerful institutions, the church, the state, and science, all saw us as some kind of a threat. They sent out a warning. They urged people to be careful and afraid of who we are when we were openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. Thankfully today, the New York Times and more people in places around our world know better than to sound such alarm bells or to perpetuate such irresponsible or irrational fears of who we truly are. But much of the world still today doesn't know its LGBTQ citizens or their neighbors well enough to treat us as full human beings, deserving of full dignity. So there's still a long way to go. Openly has an opportunity. It has the potential to shed the kind of light and the kind of truth that can liberate. So I urge Openly today to take an even closer look at all of who we are in all of our details of LGBTQ plus people throughout the world. And please look at their website, openlynews.com, to find out more about their work and to help Openly share our true and extraordinarily diverse stories.